Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kuf Gimel. This month's learning is sponsored by Adam, Carolyn, Michal, Josh, Benny, Izzy, Shim, Zoe, and Yehuda in loving memory of Judith Rosenfeld Hachstadter, Gittel Bakrandel Binyamin Ben Sion for her Shloshim. She was an elegant, smart, hardworking, outspoken person who survived the Shoah alone and came to Montreal and built a family and a business. She learned from her parents to be observant, honest, and a giver of tzedakah anonymously. She loved going to shul on the Yamim Noraim, especially when there was a good chazan. Ma Safta and Great Safta, Ateret Roshenu, we will try to emulate you and carry on your and Dad's legacy with much love and admiration. We miss you. Today's daf is sponsored by Heather Stone, in loving memory of her grandma Rose, Rachel Leah Bat Aharon Begolda, on her 39th year at site. She taught me to light Shabbat candles, and I still use her grandmother's candlesticks. Today's daf is sponsored by Jane Lizer in honor of Nikki's birthday. Happy birthday. I'm so proud of you for doing this incredible learning. Love you very much, Mom. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. So we started the 7th chapter. I'll remind you of the Mishna from the page before. But today we're going to deal with both in this Mishna and the next Mishna is somebody who sells a field. That's a beit kor. If you remember, that means 30 se'ah. Okay, we're going to talk about kabim, se'im today. Okay, there's 6 kav to a se'ah, 30 se'ah to a kor. So someone sells a beit kor. That means 30 se'ah means a field that you can plant 30 se'ahs worth. It's a measurement of seeds. So someone says, beit kor afar ani mocher lecha. Okay, the next mission we're going to deal with a different issue, which is what's the margin of error? What if you gave too much, you gave too little? Okay, we'll get back to that. But first, we're going to start with, how do we measure beit kor afar? What is considered part of the field? What if you have ditches or holes in the ground, cracks in the ground, or you have, maybe ditches is too big a word, a ditch is too big. We're talking about something smaller like a crack where you can't actually plant the field. The obvious reason why you're buying a field is because you want to be able to plant in the field. Or you have stones, rocks that are big and block your ability to plant in the field. So according to the Mishnah, it all depends on how deep they are or how tall they are. Once they're 10 handbreadths tall or 10 handbreadths deep, right, depends whether you're talking about the rocks or the cracks, then we're going to say, oh, that's already its own separate domain, not considered part of the sale, which reminds us of all these laws we learned in Shabbat, Eruvin, about the size of domains, also in Sukkah, apropos what's coming up. Not coming up in the daf, but coming up in the calendar. Then we have this other issue, which is, what if you said, the Mishnah started discussing, okay, the Mishnah started discussing, what if we now have, okay, the Mishnah started, Gemara started then quoting a Mishnah. Okay, so basically we have this issue. Once it's 10 tefachim deep, let's just review. Once it's 10 tefachim deep, we're going to basically say that is not part of the field. That's considered separate. And then if it was, let's say, a beit kor altogether, including the stones, including the cracks, you would have to fill in. If you were the seller and I was the buyer, you would have to fill in. So now what happens if we, what if we now have less than 10 tefachim? If it's less than 10 tefachim deep, then it's considered part of the field, basically. Okay, so there's some cracks, there's some stones, but that doesn't really get in the way so much. It's not that deep, it's not its own domain, so we just leave that. So now the Gemara says, Tanan Hatan, just wait 1 second. I'll have to stop for half a second. Sorry. Okay, the Mishnah now, the Gemara quotes a Mishnah. The Mishnah is in Arakhin. Arakhin is all about consecrating items. So in the laws of consecrating items, if you would consecrate a field, the law is if it's an ancestral field, then what happens? You consecrate the field. And if it's a beit kor, 30 se'ah, you have to give 50 shekel kesef. There's a set amount. And depending on where you are in the Yovel cycle, the Jubilee year, that would affect, right? If it's the beginning, then you would have to give 50. For each year you deduct, okay, because each year it's worth a little less. Anyway, we're not going to get into all of that right now. So if you're Magdish Sadeh with the Gemara quotes, and let's just start reading from there. So we're 3 lines from the bottom of Kuf Bet Amud Bet. Hamagdish Sadeh b'shat hayovel noten lo lebeit zera chomer so'olim 50 shekel kesef. That's the amount for Zera chomer sorim is 30 se'ah of wheat barley that you could plant. You would give 50 shekel kesef, but just like in our Mishnah, hayusham nikim amukim 10 tfachim, osleim gvohim 10 tfachim, ein nimdidim mima, pachol mikein nimdidim mima. Same exact thing as our Mishnah. If you did that field, it would be worth 50 shekel kesef. But if there's these stones or rocks that are too tall, right, their own domain, 10 tfachim deep or high or in height, then that's not considered part of your how much money you're supposed to give. So if it was a bait core, but it had these stones, you would deduct that amount and give less. You would give the proportional amount. But now the Gemara asks a question. Let's talk about the cracks in the ground. If you have cracks in the ground that are 10 tfachim deep. Now, by the way, the commentaries say that we're not just talking about depth. It has to be 4 by 4 handbreadths of length and width. Okay, if it's less than that, it's not really significant either. Okay, even though it doesn't say that, they assume, and that goes back to laws of Shabbat also, where it's 10 deep with 4 by 4 handbreadths of width and length. So now the Gemara says, wait, if you have a crack that's 10 deep, 4 by 4 width and length, so that's like its own space where you could actually plant it. So while we understand that it's not going to be its own independent unit, and it's not considered part of this field, but the Gemara says, in the Mishna and Arakhin there, why doesn't it say that when you have something that's 10 deep, so it's not considered part of this field, but it should be its own field? Because now a rock you can't plant on, but if you have a crack in the ground that's 10 deep, 4 by 4 wide, you can actually plant something there. So why don't we say, measure your field minus that amount, and that you give, and then why don't we view this crack as if it's a field by itself? And then you figure out, okay, what's the proportion between this and a bait core? How many years left in the Jubilee year, and come up with an amount. So the first easy answer would be to say, which the Gemara is going to bring up as a v'chitema, and if you would say, and then we'll reject that, but v'chitema kevan de lo have a bait core lo kache. Now maybe you say, well, that's because a field that's not 30 se'ah that I consecrated, you don't actually have to pay the money for. In other words, maybe the Torah said, Zera chomer sorim is 50 shekel kesef. And we assumed until now, well, and then you do the proportional amount. Well, maybe you don't do proportions. Maybe it's only if it's a big core. And if it's not that big, maybe you don't have to give anything to the temple, or it doesn't go by this amount, or maybe it would be something different entirely. Well, that's not true, okay? So they're suggesting that maybe it's too small to be consecrated, but that's not true, because we're going to learn right now from a Braita, any size you have to, if you consecrate a field of any size, again, you figure out the proportional rate of, if 30 se'ah, which is a core, would be 50 shekel kesef, then half would be half, and a quarter would be a quarter. And okay, it doesn't matter whatever size it would be, which will lead us back to our question. So then why isn't this crack, which is, again, 10 tefachim deep, 4 by 4 wide, why, since you can plant there, why isn't it consecrated on its own? So right now we're in the potential answer, which we're going to reject. So if you're going to say, well, it's not a big core, so maybe it's not sanctified at all, the Braita reads like this. Sadeh. Okay, what are they talking about? First, we have to read 2 psukim in the Torah. In Vayikra, chapter 27, it says, we're in first verse 16. If it's an ancestral field and you consecrate it to God, it goes according to how much you can plant there. And now we got the amount that we saw before, which is this bait core is 50 shekel kesef. And I'm skipping a few psukim and going to pasuk 19. And if the one who consecrates it redeems it, okay, they're the person who pays the money to the temple, which is usually what happens. Sometimes they don't, and then someone else does. But if the person themselves do it, they have to add a fifth. Okay, that's not important right now. In other words, not just you give the value, you also give an added fifth. But what they're pointing out here is when it says the one who consecrates it redeems the field, it could have said it without the word the field. Could have just said redeems it. You already know we're talking about the field. So why does it say redeems the field? That word field is extra. So the Braita darshans that word. That's where the Braita starts. Sadeh. They're talking about Sadeh in verse 19 of chapter 27 in Vayikra, and says, Matamud lomar, why do you need that word? It's unnecessary. To which they say, Lafisha ne'emar zera chomer se'orim b'chamishim shekel kesef. Since it already said, right, zera chomer se'orim b'chamishim shekel kesef, a bait core is worth 50, maybe it's only if you do a bait core. Maybe any less isn't consequent. You don't have to give the money because maybe it's not significant enough. How do you know that all these other measurements, a letech is half a bait core, chatzi letech, a quarter, a se'ah, a tirkav, a chatzi tirkav? How do we know that all these other amounts that are way less than a bait core also? Talmud lamar sedeh mikol makom. So our first attempt to answer didn't work. So again, let's just remind us of our question. We have a field that if it has rocks that are 10 tefachim, or actually we're talking about more about the ditches here or the cracks. If we have cracks that are 10 tefachim deep, 4 by 4 wide, they're not, according to the Mishna, they're not consecrated really. You don't have to bring their value to the temple. But why? If you can plant in them, you should bring them based on their proportional value, right? What the size is in proportion to this bait core. And it should be some sort of amount. Why not? To which the Gemara doesn't have an answer. They try to suggest maybe that kind of small amount isn't consecrated, but it's not true because the extra word sadeh comes to say any field. So let's come up with a different answer. Amar Rav Ukvar Barchama, hacha b'nikaim meleim mayim askinan delav b'nei zri aninu. The Mishnah there must be talking about cracks in the ground that are filled with water, and because they're filled with water, presumably they're always filled with water, they can't be planted. You can't plant in an area that's totally filled with water. So we're talking about a crack that's filled with water. If it was a crack that wasn't filled with water, right, this is what we call an ukimta. That Mishnah, which basically said that the cracks aren't consecrated on their own and you don't have to bring their value independently, is only if they're not plantable. But if you could plant there, because they're not filled with water, you would have to. And that's the resolution. And daikanami dekatane, and we can further prove that, because look at where we talk about these cracks. We compare, they're listed together with rocks. Dekatani dumia de slaim, they're listed next to slaim. Now, this is a method that Gemara often uses, which is if two things are next to each other in a Tanaitic source, we're assuming that one is like the other. So if you have rocks in the ground, you can't plant there. So therefore, if you have cracks in the ground, it must be cracks that can't be planted, which means, right, Shema Mina, it must be ones that are filled with water. So far, what we did in the Gemara is, okay, we started with quoting our Mishnah. That was, we learned our Mishnah, which had to do with sails and cracks and stones in the field. Then we moved to a Mishnah in Arakhin. We established that the Mishnah in Arakhin, because of a question we had, must be only talking about cracks that are filled with water, in which case they're just like the stones. And now we're going to come back to our Mishnah. And we're going to say before we get to our Mishnah, we have one other question. The Mishnah in Arakhin there said, right, if the cracks are 10 deep, then they're not considered as part of the field. And we had to say, and they're not consecrated on their own because they're filled with water and they can't be planted, and therefore it's not considered a field. But now the Gemara says, well, if they're filled with water and you can't plant in them, well, what did the Mishnah say? If they're less than 10 tefachim deep, then they're just considered part of the property. But if we're saying when they're more than 10 tefachim deep, they're filled with water, then when they're less than 10 tefachim deep, they also must be filled with water, in which case, even if they're less than 10 handbreadths deep, if they're filled with water and you can't plant in them, why are they considered part of the field? And you have to bring their value to the temple, right? It doesn't make any sense. If you can't plant in them, why would they be considered part of the field? To which they answer, Hanhu nagne da'ara mikru, or shidre da'ara mikru. These cracks in the ground are considered, they're called, when they're less than 10 tefachim deep, they have a different name. Okay, once they're 10 tefachim deep, remember what we said. They're like their own unique domain. So they're not considered part of the ground. They're part of this land, this property. But if they're less than 10 tefachim deep, then they're called nigane da'ara. They're called cracks of the ground, cracks of the field. And if they're rocks and they're jutting out from the field, as opposed to the cracks which are in the field, they're called shidrei da'ara. They're called the spines of the land. Because they're less than 10 tefachim deep or in height, then we're basically going to say, oh, people just call those parts of the ground. They're cracks in the ground. They're spines of the ground, in which case their name defines them as part of this land. So because by name they're considered part of this land, even if you can't plant there, obviously you can't plant where there's rocks, and in these cracks, you can't plant there because they're filled with water, because that's the way we established the Mishna. Therefore, it doesn't matter that you can't plant there. They're still considered secondary to the ground. So they're still considered part of this field. Once they're 10 tefachim deep, that's a whole different story. Then they're no longer considered part of the field. And that's in name they're talking about. So now the Gemara says, back to our topic. Well, is sales going to be the same as consecrating? In which case, if we said that these cracks have to be filled with water, and if they're not filled with water, then in the Mishna and Arakhin, they'd actually be consecrated on their own. So hachamai, what about us? Are we talking about cracks that are just like stones that can't be planted at all? Because if we then only filled with water, well, Amar Rav Papa, Rav Papa says, no. In our Mishnah, now we understand why we brought this Mishnah. Because we brought the Mishnah in Arakhin to say that Mishnah is only when they're filled with water, but our Mishnah wouldn't be the same. It would be even if it's not filled with water. Still, what? If they're 10 tefachim deep, they're still not part of the land, even though you can theoretically plant there. Now, why is that? If I buy a field, a bait core, and I have land that I can plant, and I have these cracks in the ground that are 4 by 4, 10 tefachim deep, and I can plant there, well, if that's the case, why is it not considered part of my field? My taima, ein adam rotzeh shitei ma'otav b'makom echad v'yira'u lo kishnayim u'shlosha makomot. Well, the Gemara answers a very obvious answer, which is, why would I want to buy a field? In other words, sales, and this goes back to things we've been discussing. We've been discussing sales for the last while. Sales have different laws than other areas because sales all depends on what I'm looking to buy. What am I purchasing? I want to buy a field that I can plow. I don't want to buy a field where all of a sudden I have a ditch in the ground that I have to go down to plow and plant there. It's not convenient. I want to buy something that's flat land. So if there's a ditch that's 10 or a crack that is like a ditch because it's 10 tefachim deep, 4 by 4 wide, even though theoretically I can plant in there, it's wholly inconvenient. And that's not what I meant to buy. So when it comes to sales, it's different. When it's consecrating, it's just a matter of what's the value of what I consecrated. So there's the value to the field, and there's the value to that little area in and of itself. It has value. It would be consecrated on its own as a separate field if it didn't have water in it, because I could plant there. So that I would do both. But in a sale, that's not what I'm intending. I don't want to buy something that has a ditch there. So therefore, we distinguish between the Mishna and Arakhin and our Mishna. The Mishna and Arakhin is only if they're filled with water. Otherwise, they be consecrated on their own. And our Mishna is even if they're not filled with water. And even if you could plant there, I could still demand, give me that amount in land and, fill in what I should have gotten here, because that's not convenient for me. Matkifla Ravina. But Ravina comes and asks, based on what we learned earlier today, but Hadumia Disleim Katani, didn't we say in the Mishna and Arakhin, well, they're mentioned rocks and cracks. And the cracks must be like the rocks, that they can't be planted. So wouldn't you say the same thing here? Maslaim de la b'neis ri'aninu, afhaninami de la b'neis ri'aninu. Right? Just like the rocks, where there's rocks you can't plant, also where there's cracks you can't plant. To which they answer, ki katane dumia dislaim apachot mikan. So they say, there's two cases in the Mishnah. And the one that's talking about water is actually related to one of them, okay? Meaning, there's case number one is if it's more than 10. And there we said, even if it's not filled with water, you can claim, give me more land as the buyer. But if it's less than 10, then here we're going to have the similarity to the stones. If it's less than 10, what did we say? It's secondary to the land, and it's basically considered part of the land. And here we're going to say, even if it's filled with water, even if you can't plant, as long as it's less than 10 tefachim deep, it's still considered secondary to the land, and therefore it's considered you've gotten exactly what you wanted. You can't claim, oh, I can't plant there because it's filled with water, because just like this, the rocks, you can't plant there. Also, the cracks, you can't plant there because they're filled with water. Even if they're filled with water, you have no complaints as the buyer, because they're not 10 tefachim deep, and that would be where we compare it to rocks, but not the case where it's 10 tefachim deep. Okay. Now, that's the first section of today. So again, let's just summarize. We brought in a Mishnah in Arakhin, which seemed exactly the same as our Mishnah, but then we proved that it's not exactly the same as our Mishnah, because there, if it was filled with water, if it wasn't filled with water, it would actually be consecrated in and of itself as its own field. Whereas in sales, it's not the same thing. And that's clear because in sales, you don't want this crack in the middle of your land where you can plant there. It's not going to really help you because it's annoying to have to plant something at a different level, to deal with the planting of it, the plowing of it. All that will be a headache for you. And therefore in sales, you can claim to get more land. Now we're going to move on to the next section of the Mishnah, which is, the part about pachot mikam dedimima. Now it's in parentheses, but we're going to read it anyway, because this, just to know that that's the line we're relating to right now. The Mishnah had said, if it's less than 10 tefachim, it's considered part of the land, and therefore you can't claim as the buyer, give me more land because there's this big crack in the ground or there's a big rock, okay? Because it's not deep enough to be considered on its own. But even that's going to have limitations. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. What happens here is the Mishnah didn't really give you the full picture. First of all, they didn't tell you it had to be 4 by 4 wide, which the commentaries talk about. The Gemara doesn't even talk about that. 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths wide. And they're now going to talk about how much space does this take up in your whole field? Because, right, we talked only about the depth, but what if it takes up a big area of your field? So comes Rabbi Yitzchak and says, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Trashim she'amru, which is these stones that they talked about, and presumably also the cracks in the ground, Beit Arba'at Kabin, up to 4 kav of space, meaning a place where you could plant 4 kav. Now, 6 kav to a se'ah, 30 se'ah to a core. So if we're talking about a beit core, 4 kav to a beit core. Okay, a beit core, let's just put it into kabin, because it's se'ah times 6. 30 times 6 would be 180. So it would be 4 to 180. Okay, so Trashim Shamru Beit Arba Kapim. Up to 4 kav of stones, we say, fine. That, if it's less than 10 tefachim deep, that's considered canceled to the field. Once you get to 4 kav, that's already a significant amount of your field. And then those stones are considered separate. Okay, so even if they don't have the depth, they cover too much of an area. And that's a place where you could plant 4 kav of seeds. Amar Rav Ukva bar Chama, but he's going to limit this a little bit. And he says, we're not talking about any 4 kav. If you have 4 kav spread out over this 180 kav field, that's not really very significant. But if you have 4 kav of stones that, again, are not 10 tefachim deep, but there's in a space where you could plant 5 kav, okay, which is not a big space. And this is all about what has significance. Stones, if they're scattered all throughout your entire field, even if all together it's 4 kav, that's not so much. But if they're in an area that you could plant 5 kav, 4 kav in the area you could plant 5 kav in a field that's a big core, that's already a significant amount that the buyer could say, give me land instead of that. Rav Chia bar Abba, Rabbi Yochanan, he seems to disagree with Rav Ukva bar Chama, although I will just point out that there's some people who explain this totally differently, but I'm going to go with the commentary that he disagrees. And he says, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, they have to be, once it's in the majority of the field, then already it's considered too scattered. But if it's in the minority of the field, which means it's not in a space of where you could plant 5 kav, like the first person said, right? Space of 5 kav, already it's significant. Any more scattered, not significant. He says, has to be scattered throughout the minority of the field for it to be significant. Once it gets to the majority of the field, which the way the commentary is talking about is kind of funny, like we would say 15.1, right? So 4 kav in a space of 15.1 se'ah, because core is 30. They say 16 se'ah. That's the way they talk in mathematical terms. The majority is 16 se'ah. So 4 kav in a space of 16 se'ah, that already is considered too scattered, but way different than 5 kav. 5 kav is very small, right? They say, no. It can be scattered even more than that as long as you don't get to the majority of the field. As long as it's in the minority of the field, that's considered significant. So again, it's less than 10, but it covers a space of 4 that's spread out in the minority of the field. So now, by Rav Chia bar Abba, we're going to start a slew of questions, for which we're going to have almost no answers. By Rav Chia bar Abba, Rubam b'miyutan u'miyutan b'rubam mahu. It sounds like a very confusing question. It's not so confusing. This is all one case. It's not two separate questions. What if, now he just said, okay, Rav Chia bar Abba quoted Rabbi Yochanan is saying, in order for the 4 kav of stones to be considered significant, even though they don't have the depth, they're still considered significant. They have to be not in the majority of the field, but in the minority. What if the majority of the 4 was in the minority of the field? Okay, so most of the 4, you have altogether 4 kav of rock, but the majority of the 4 was in the minority of the field, and miyutan, so let's say 3 out of the 4 were in 14 kav, and the other 1 was scattered in the rest of the field, okay, the 16 kav. Miyutan berubah mahu. So would you say, well, at least most of the 4 kav were in the minority? Would that work? We don't have an answer to that question. And if you weren't surprised by this, you're right. That was from Chia bar Abba's question, but you won't be surprised to know the next slew of questions comes from Rabbi Yirmiyah, who loves to ask these kind of questions. By Rabbi Yirmiyah, turning now to Amabet. Kishir mahu, kishura mahu, itzadini mahu, derech hakalaton mahu. He has 4 questions. And the assumption is he's talking about, according to Chia bar Abba, where they have to be scattered within the minority of the field, which means if the 4 kav of stones are scattered within the majority of the field, it's not a problem. But what if they're in the majority of the field? However, they're in a particular formation, which makes it very complicated to plow. So for example, the stones are all in a circle formation. That's the shiur. And the commentaries say each one kind of builds on the previous, which each one makes it actually harder to plow. So even if you say in a circle formation, it's not so bad, because while it's true, you're going to have a hard time plowing in that area. It's just in that area, but you can plow the rest of the field very easily, because what's going to happen? Your plow is going to get up against stones. It's going to be a problem. Kishur mahu, what if it's a straight line across the entire length of the field? And then the problem is, according to the Rashbam, well, when you plow shti and arev, meaning you do both, right? Both vertically and horizontally. So if you have a line going through the entire length of the field, when you plow in that direction, right, you're going to, every time you're doing a row, you're going to hit into that one row that's basically blocking off. When you're going perpendicular to that row, you're going to get stuck on the rocks. Itzadinin, there's a big debate what this is. Many people hold it's the horns. You can look, by the way, if you have a regular Gemara, there's pictures of this in the Rashbam, although many people think that the picture of the row, you'll see it's more like a square, like rows. And people say that's not necessarily the way the Rashbam, somebody added those pictures and it's not necessarily what the Rashbam really meant. So for itzdanin, they say it's stadion is like a stadium. It's a stadium bull, and it's the bull's horns, the horns of a stadium bull, okay, which is really just horns of a bull, which kind of they go 2 rows, right? So this is, imagine it in the field. You have 2 rows of stones that kind of go out at angles to either side, like a horn, or a kalaton is like a W, okay? And those really block your way. It's very hard to plow in that way. Mau, and the answer to most of Rabbi Yirmiyah's questions is teku. Now they bring up another issue. This is all dealing with these stones in this field. So until now, we said the stone had to be a certain depth, or even if it wasn't that depth, in order to say, you get extra land as the buyer. If it's not depth, it could be quantity, right? Or how much space it took up, again, within how much space, either within 5 kav or within the majority, or how much of a burden is it on, right? Which we don't know the answer to these questions, but circles, all these kind of zigzag. Okay, but now, what if they're at the edge of the field? That's a different story. So we're going to have two cases where it's at the edge of the field, Tana, and it's not so clear from the words of the Gemara, but we'll go with the Rashbam's commentary. If it was one lone stone, but it doesn't say this, but they mean on the border, okay, meaning on the edge of the field, but right outside the field, even any little amount is not measured. And it's right on the border, like on the outer border of the field, for sure that's not included, because that's not really in the field. We're talking about stones that are in the field. This is outside. And even, okay, they're missing the word even, but that's how the Rashbam understands this. And if it's next to the border on the inside of your field, as long as it's up against the border, we're going to say that's not part of the field. Because again, it's not in the middle of the field, it's on the side. So now come our questions, which we're not going to have answers to. By Rav Papa, mufsak afal beintayim mahu. What if it's near the border, but there's a little dirt in between it and the border? Now the Rashbam says little means less than 3 handbreadths of dirt. This reminds us, we're coming up on Sukkot. If you remember, levud and less than 3 tefachim is as if it's attached to the ground, like if you talk about the walls of your sukkah and things like that. So if there's a little bit of dirt, but it's usually the amount that we use the words levud, the law of levud to basically say we view that stone as if it's attached to the border. Do we call that attached to the border? Do we use laws of levud here or not? Teku, we don't know. And by Rav Ashi, afar milamata v'tzuma milamala, or afar milamala v'tzuma milamata mahu. Tzuma is the rock. What if it's up against the border, but there's dirt underneath, and then there's stone at the top? So it's still up against the border, but the stone's at the top. Theoretically, you could take out the stone and plant in the ground underneath, in the earth underneath. Or if there's a far on top of the stone, which theoretically means, right, it's not such a thick layer, but maybe you could plant in the dirt on top and the stones underneath, and maybe that would work. Mahu. So is that considered plantable land or not? And the answer is teku. We don't have answers to those questions. So we have another Mishna to go, but we're going to stop here for a minute and review. So what we did in this section, we started with this Mishna, which talked about the depths of cracks and the height of stones that are basically going to be considered blocks and that are considered separate independent units, which means the buyer can basically claim more land in place of them, or an amount that's too little. Then with the part that's deep enough, we went from there to this comparison of the Mishna in Arakhin, and then said there, though, we were talking about when they're full of water. But here, even if they're not full of water, it's still inconvenient for the buyer. Then we went to the issue of what if they're not deep enough or not tall enough. And then we said, well, that's all as long as they don't take up a certain amount of space within a certain amount of space of the field, which was either within 4 kav within 5 kabin or 4 kav within the minority of the field. Then already they're significant. And even though they don't have depth, they cover area and space, and that will be an issue. And then we had a whole bunch of other questions. Even if it's not that, it's spread out even more than that, but it's 4 kav. What if it's in a row? What if it's zigzag? What if it's this? What if it's near the border, right? So we had the only thing that was definitive there was if it's near the border, then that's even if they're not deep, even if they're not, right, they don't have to be 4 kav. Could be any size. We basically view that as not part of the field. But what if there's dirt on top? What if there's dirt on the bottom? Right? It wasn't clear how we judge and how we rule in those cases. Now we're moving on to the next Mishnah, which also talks about measuring field, but a bit of a different element, which is what we call the margin of error. So beit kor afarani mocher lecha mida bechevel. If you claim you're the seller, and you say, I'm selling you a beit kor, 30 seah. And you say midah bechevel, measured by a rope. That's how they measured things in those days. They used ropes, they measured what the size of the rope was, and then they would use the rope to measure the space. What if? So if you, as the seller, said, I'm selling you a beit kor, and basically this is a way of saying exactly a beit kor, because you said midah bechevel, as is measured by the rope. Pichet kol shehu yinakeh, hotir kol shehu yachzir. If you gave me any less, then you have to deduct it from what I paid. Any little amount, any discrepancy, what happened? You said you're going to sell me this. You gave me something else. It didn't measure up exactly. If it was too little, you have to deduct it from the price. If it was too much, then yachzir, then I have to give back. Now, what do I have to give back? We're going to get to that soon. There's two options. Either I have to give back the extra land, or I have to pay you money for the extra land that I got, because I only paid you for a beit kor. Maybe I have to pay you more, and we'll see in a minute in the Mishna which one I'm supposed to do. That's case one. Mida b'chevel. You said exact. What if you said, imamar, hein chaser, hein yeter, give or take, whether it's a little more, whether it's a little less. I'm giving you a beit kor, but a little more, a little less. Even if you gave me a quarter kav per se'ah, okay, that's 1/24th more, okay, now remember, we're talking about a beit kor, so that would be multiplied times 30, okay, so it would be 7.5 kabim, basically, because a quarter kav times 30 would be 7.5. So even if you gave me a quarter kav per se'ah, or, right, you gave me too little, quarter kav per se'ah, or you gave me too much, meaning more than a quarter kav per se'ah, or up to a quarter kav per se'ah, higio. The sale is a good sale, and no one can claim anything. Okay, that's something we discussed when we discussed the idea that when I buy something, the assumption is I buy a certain amount of bad in it, right? There's a certain percentage mixed in of bad, and I give up on that. I'm okay with that. This is the same idea, and there we quoted we quoted an explanation on this Mishna. We didn't quote the exact Mishna, but we quoted this halacha. So the assumption is that both sides have what's called mechila. They assume there's going to be a certain margin of error. Okay, that's because you use the words, right, more or less. Now, first question of the Gemara is going to be, what if you didn't say midah b'chevel, and you didn't say more or less, you didn't say anything, you just said beit kor, what's the halacha? And we're going to struggle to figure that out. But right now, we're in the Mishna, which gave these two different cases. Yoter mikan yaseh cheshbon, but any more than that, then you do a cheshbon, meaning we figure out if it's more than a quarter kav per se'ah, then if I got too much, I have to give back. If you got too little, right? If you gave me too little, you'll have to give me more. But now they say, ma'u machzir lo. Now, as the buyer, what do I have to give back? Remember we said before, I have to give back. And what do I have to give back? So again, either it's midah b'chevel, where I have to give back any difference, or if it's more than a reva kav per se'ah, I have to give back. What do I give back? Ma'ot. I give back money. I don't give back the land. Why not? Because it's inconvenient for the buyer to get a little piece of land. This isn't a significant enough space to plant anything. So if you gave me too much, you have the upper hand, because what are you going to do with a little corner of land? It's not going to help you. Only if, like, let's say you had the nearby field, so you're happy to take a little extra land to have more land, but you get to decide as the seller, not me. So why did it say what we just said, that you get money? To say that the seller has the upper hand here. Okay, the seller has the upper hand. And again, if the seller said, midah b'chevel, I see, Adina, you're saying, what about this mocher b'ayin yafa mocher? That's not the same here. Because here we're saying, if the seller said exactly, and then you're off, or, right, mocher b'ayin yafa, by the way, has to do with something else. That's also that you gave the person a path or not, or other things. But here we're saying you said a measurement, and then you gave more. So again, depends on the case. If you said more or less, then only if it's above a certain amount do we assume, oh, that much, you just made a mistake. This is more like a mistake in the measurement. So in that case, the seller has the upper hand, because what's the seller going to do with a small piece of land? But let's say it was more than a beit kor field, or let's say it was a beit kor field. Now, what did we say? Up to 7.5. That was our measurement, right? A quarter kav times 30, because a quarter kav per se'ah, 30 for 30 se'ah, 30 quarter kavs, which comes out to 7.5. What if it was more than 7.5? So let's say you got up to 9. There were 9 kav off. Then you get back the 9 kav. But now, in theory, I just give you the money for it. I just have to pay you extra. But once it gets to 9 kav, that's the minimum size of a field. You might remember, you might not. It's a long time ago. But in the beginning of the Masechah, we discussed on Daf Yud Aleph, what's the minimum size of a field. So for a field, we said, Basadeh Beit Tisha Kabim, a place where you can plant 9 kav of soil, of seeds, is already a significant space. So if we're 9 kav off, then I give you back I can give you back the field. Even if you insist, I want the money, I don't want the field, I could say, what do you mean? I'm giving you a whole field. Again, it's not really a whole field, but it's enough of a minimum size of a field. Ubigina, and if it's a garden, which I saw some commentaries said that the difference between a garden and a field is the garden has a stream of water coming through, and therefore things grow much better. Beit chatzi kav u'kedivrei Rabbi Akiva beit rova. Okay, in a gina, it's a half a kav, or according to Rabbi Akiva, it's a quarter kav. There was a machloket on Daf Yud Aleph about what's the minimum size of a gina. Is it a quarter kav or a half kav? It's much smaller. At that point, it's already considered a significant field. So therefore, a significant garden. And therefore, again, as the buyer, I can insist you take it back if I get to that amount. Machzir lo, and then machzir lo et hakarka. So in that point, I don't care what you want as the buyer, as the seller, but as the buyer, I'm allowed to return you because it's already enough of a field that's considered a field by itself. Below, now this sentence is a bit tricky and the Gemara is going to change it because it doesn't really read well. Below, but we'll get to that later, but lo et harova bilvad machzir el et kol hamotal. Once you get beyond the amount, the minimum amount that we assume everyone's mochel, but everyone gives in on, but once we're past that amount, you don't just get back the motal. It should be flipped here, the rova and the motar. It should be lo et hamotal bilvad machzir. You don't just get back the extra, what you went beyond the 7.5 kav for the 30 or quarter kav for a se'ah, but you get back kol harova'im bill. You get all the quarter kavs. In other words, let's say it was this 30 se'ah field and we were off by 8 kav. So you don't just get back the extra half kav, you get back everything. Okay, so if I got a field that was much bigger than I should have, and once we go over, and this is what we quoted earlier, once we go over, you get the whole thing back. Okay, so that's it, even though there's mechila is up until a certain amount. Once we get past that amount, we assume there's no mechila at all. Okay, then we just get everything back and we put it as, kav efes, as they say, at 0, where it should be. So now the Gemara asks the question we said the Gemara is going to ask, and with this we'll finish. Well, what if you just said, I'm selling you a beit kor, and you didn't say exactly, or you didn't say more or less, you just said a beit kor. Then what's the halacha? And we're going to try to figure that out. We'll leave that for tomorrow. So what we did today, the first part we already reviewed. The second part is basically about the margin of error that we assume, and it all depends on what language you use. And we saw that until the field gets a certain amount of error, a certain measurement that's something worthy of planting, the seller gets paid extra. If, let's say, they gave too much to the buyer would have to pay extra, which you have to wonder, what if the buyer doesn't have any more money? Good question. It's not exactly fair to the buyer, but it's also not fair to the seller to give them back this little amount that they can't do anything with, and therefore the buyer has to spend the money and give back the amount. And obviously, if the buyer didn't get enough, the seller has to give the extra amount to the buyer of what the buyer, or theoretically could also deduct. There, they don't discuss which is, does the seller have the upper hand in that area or not. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone an easy fast, a Gmar Chatima Tova, and may we have better, quieter days in Israel.